Men like Arthur build their lives on predictability. Portfolios, profit margins, wives who blend into the wallpaper. He thought he was trading in a beige cardigan for a designer dress. He thought the divorce papers were the end of a very boring chapter. He was wrong, because when you throw away a woman who never speaks, you never learn who she's been staying quiet for. And when 12 black Rolls-Royces block off Fifth Avenue to take her home, you realize you didn't just break a vow. You started a war. The divorce papers sat on the kitchen island, a thick stack of crisp, white legal bond. Arthur had placed them precisely in the center of the dark Calcutta marble. He liked the contrast. It looked clean, official. Lana stood on the other side of the island. She was wearing the same oversized grey cashmere sweater she wore every Sunday morning, her dark hair pulled back in a loose, messy knot held together by a plastic clip. She looked at the papers. She didn't touch them. "My lawyers drew it up yesterday," Arthur said. His voice was level, cultivated. It was the voice he used when acquiring mid-sized tech startups. "It's beyond generous, Lana. You keep the townhouse in Boston, $2 million in a trust. The alimony is structured to maintain your current standard of living indefinitely. You won't have to work." He waited for the tears. He had a speech prepared for the tears. A box of tissues sat nearby on the counter, a strategic placement. Lana didn't cry. She reached out and traced the edge of the top page with her index finger. "Why now?" she asked. Her voice was quiet. It was always quiet. It was one of the things that had drawn him to her 5 years ago, back when he was an exhausted junior executive, looking for a soft place to land. Now it just irritated him. He was the CEO of a private equity firm. He didn't need a soft landing anymore. He needed a co-pilot. He needed someone who could hold a room at a gala, who knew which fork to use for the fish course, who could banter with senators. He needed Chloe. "We've grown apart," Arthur said, falling back on the sterilized language of his therapist. "You prefer the quiet. You stay home. You read. I'm moving in a different world now, Lana. I need someone who fits into that world." Lana's eyes flicked up to his. They were a deep, heavy brown, usually entirely unreadable. For a fraction of a second, Arthur thought he saw something flash in them. Amusement? Pity? It was gone before he could name it. "Someone like Chloe," Lana said. Arthur blinked, caught off guard. He swallowed the sudden lump in his throat. "Leave Chloe out of this. This is about us. It's about fundamental incompatibility." Okay. That was it. Just okay. She picked up a pen from the mug next to the coffee maker. It was a cheap blue plastic ballpoint from a dry cleaner. Not the silver Mont Blanc he had gifted her for their 3rd anniversary. She flipped to the last page. She didn't read the clauses. She didn't check the asset division. She just signed her name. Lana Maria. Just her first and middle name, stylized in a sharp, slanted cursive. She had never legally taken his last name, a quirk he had always found annoying but never fought her on. She dropped the pen. It clattered against the marble. "I'll pack my things," she said, turning away. Arthur stood in the kitchen, feeling a strange, hollow ache in his chest. He was supposed to feel liberated. He had spent months agonizing over this conversation, drafting and redrafting it in his head while lying awake next to her. He had expected begging. He had expected anger. Her total lack of resistance felt less like an agreement and more like a dismissal. He followed her to the master bedroom. She had already pulled a suitcase from the closet. It wasn't the Louis Vuitton trunk set they had bought in Paris. It was an old, battered leather duffel bag. She was tossing clothes into it with mechanical efficiency. A pair of jeans, a few plain shirts, a heavy wool coat. "You can take your time," Arthur offered, leaning against the doorframe. He felt the desperate need to be the generous one in the room. "You have 30 days to vacate. I'll stay at a hotel, or I'll stay elsewhere." "No need," Lana said. She zipped the bag. It was shockingly small. 5 years of marriage, condensed into a bag that could fit in an overhead bin. She walked over to her jewelry box. Arthur tensed. This was where the money was. The diamond tennis bracelets, the sapphire earrings. Lana didn't open the box. Instead, she reached for her left hand. She slid the platinum wedding band off her finger. She placed it carefully on top of the lacquered wood box. "Keep it," she said. Arthur pushed off the doorframe. "Lana, be reasonable. The jewelry is yours. The clothes in that closet cost a fortune. Take what belongs to you." She picked up the leather duffel bag and slung the strap over her shoulder. She looked around the expansive, floor-to-ceiling glass bedroom, overlooking the sprawling grey grid of the city. "Nothing in this room belonged to me, Arthur," she said quietly. "It never did." She walked past him. He caught a faint whiff of her perfume, something simple, vanilla and cedar. It was the only trace she was leaving behind. Arthur followed her out to the foyer. The penthouse was dead quiet, save for the hum of the climate control. He watched her pull on a dark trench coat over her sweater. She looked small, fragile. Guilt he had been suppressing all morning finally began to bubble up, sour and acidic in the back of his throat. He was kicking a stray dog out into the rain. "Do you want me to call a car?" Arthur asked. "It's pouring out there. I can have Thomas bring the Bentley around and take you to the airport, or wherever you're going." "No." Lana tied the belt of her coat. "I have a ride." Arthur frowned. "An Uber? In this weather?" "Lana, don't be a martyr." She finally looked at him. Really looked at him. The deference, the quiet subservience that he had come to expect, that he had frankly relied on to build his ego. It was gone. Her face was entirely blank, wiped clean of any emotion. It was like looking at a stranger. "Goodbye, Arthur," she said. She opened the heavy oak door and stepped into the private elevator lobby. The doors slid shut, cutting her off from view. Arthur stood alone in his multi-million-dollar apartment. He exhaled a long, shaky breath. It was done. He was free. He could call Chloe right now. He could tell her to bring over a bottle of Bollinger, and they could celebrate the beginning of their life together. The power couple of the decade. Instead, he walked over to the wet bar in the living room and poured himself 3 fingers of Macallan. He didn't bother with ice. He walked over to the massive windows. The penthouse was on the 40th floor, offering a panoramic view of the avenue below. It was a miserable Tuesday afternoon. The sky was the color of bruised iron, and the rain was coming down in heavy grey sheets. The street below was a sluggish river of yellow cabs and black umbrellas. He took a sip of the scotch. It burned going down, a grounding sensation. He looked down, waiting to see Lana emerge from the awning of the building. He wanted to see her. He needed to see her hail a cab, struggling with her cheap leather bag in the rain. He needed to see her look pathetic, because if she looked pathetic, his narrative remained intact. He was the successful man who had outgrown his simple wife. Down in the lobby, Lana stepped out of the elevator. Hector, the doorman who had worked at the building for 20 years, rushed forward. "Mrs. Pendleton," Hector said, his eyes dropping to the duffel bag. "You're heading out? In this weather?" "Just Lana, Hector," she said softly. Hector looked at her face, then back at the bag. Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed quickly by a deep, genuine sadness. Arthur rarely tipped Hector. Lana knew the names of Hector's 3 grandchildren and baked him cookies at Christmas. "Do you need a taxi, Mom? I can whistle one down. It's tough right now." "Thank you, Hector, but no, they're already here." Hector frowned. "Who's here?" Lana buttoned her coat to the collar. "My brothers." Upstairs, Arthur pressed his forehead against the cold glass of the window. He checked his watch. She should be walking out any second. Then the street changed. It didn't happen all at once. It happened in a creeping wave of disruption. The constant droning hum of city traffic began to choke. From the north end of the avenue, a vehicle turned the corner. It wasn't a cab. It was a Rolls-Royce Phantom, blacked out. Not just the windows, the grille, the trim, the rims. It looked less like a luxury car and more like a mechanized predator. It moved slowly, aggressively, forcing a city bus to slam on its brakes. Behind it came another, and another. Arthur lowered his glass of scotch. He stopped breathing. A procession of identical, pitch-black Rolls-Royces was rolling down the avenue. They were moving in a perfect, synchronized line. 3, 6, 9, 12. 12 massive armored vehicles gliding through the rain-slicked streets. The yellow cabs scrambled to get out of the way, hopping curbs or idling dead in the intersection. No horns blared. The usual symphony of New York road rage was completely silenced. People on the sidewalks stopped under their umbrellas, staring. The lead Phantom pulled up directly in front of Arthur's building, parking illegally across 2 lanes of traffic. The second car pulled up tight behind it. The third angled itself to block the intersection completely. They were securing the perimeter. Arthur had seen motorcades before. Presidents, foreign dignitaries. This wasn't diplomatic, this was tactical. "What the hell?" Arthur whispered to the empty room. The rain hammered against the roof of the lead Phantom. Down on the street, the heavy suicide doors of the vehicles began to open in unison. Men stepped out into the downpour. They weren't wearing chauffeur uniforms, they were wearing dark, tailored suits that cost more than Arthur's first car. They didn't carry umbrellas. They moved with a terrifying, loose-limbed grace. Heavy muscle, broad shoulders. Arthur's corporate eyes were trained to spot alpha males in boardrooms. These men were apex predators on pavement. They took up positions around the cars. 2 men flanked the entrance to the building. Others stood in the street, hands resting casually inside their unbuttoned suit jackets. A police cruiser, stuck in the artificial traffic jam, flashed its lights. A beat cop stepped out, holding up a hand, marching toward the third Rolls-Royce. One of the men in suits turned to face the cop. The man didn't speak. He just stared. Arthur watched from 40 floors up as the cop stopped in his tracks. The cop looked at the man, looked at the line of 12 cars, and then slowly, deliberately, turned around, got back into his cruiser, and turned his lights off. Arthur's stomach dropped into a bottomless abyss. The scotch in his hand trembled. The glass doors of the lobby opened. Lana walked out into the rain. She was carrying her battered leather bag. She looked exactly as she had when she left the apartment, small, quiet, unassuming in her beige sweater and dark coat. From the rear of the lead Phantom, a man stepped out. He was incredibly tall, built like a heavyweight boxer, wearing a charcoal 3-piece suit that strained against his shoulders. He had thick, dark hair graying at the temples, and a brutal, jagged scar running down his jawline. He didn't look like a driver. He looked like an executioner. The man walked toward Lana. The rain soaked his expensive suit, but he didn't seem to notice. When he reached her, the hard, violent lines of his face melted. He reached out and took the leather duffel bag from her hand, tossing it effortlessly into the trunk of the car. Then he wrapped his massive arms around her, burying her in a fierce, protective embrace. He kissed the top of her head. Arthur watched Lana, his quiet, boring, librarian-like wife, rest her head against the chest of a man who looked capable of snapping a neck with one hand. The man pulled back. He cupped Lana's face, examining her, looking for tears, looking for bruises. Lana shook her head, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. "I'm fine." The man nodded. His eyes left Lana's face and tilted upward. He looked up the sheer glass face of the building. He looked past 39 floors of concrete and steel, his gaze locking directly onto the penthouse windows. Arthur stumbled backward. He dropped his glass. The crystal shattered against the hardwood floor, scotch splashing across his polished shoes. He couldn't have seen him. It was impossible. It was raining, the glass was tinted, and he was 40 stories up. But Arthur felt the weight of that stare in his marrow. It was a promise of violence. The man opened the rear door of the Phantom. Lana slipped inside. The man followed, closing the heavy armored door with a dull, echoing thud that Arthur felt all the way up in the penthouse. In total unison, the men on the street got back into their vehicles. The engines roared to life, a deep, guttural bass that vibrated through the city blocks. The 12 black Rolls-Royces pulled away from the curb. They didn't rush. They rolled down the avenue with the slow, arrogant crawl of absolute power, parting the traffic like the Red Sea. Within 2 minutes they were gone, swallowed by the grey smog and the relentless rain. The street below returned to normal. Cabs honked. People walked. It was as if a ghost ship had passed through the city. Arthur stood in the middle of his living room, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. His phone began to vibrate on the kitchen island. He flinched. He walked over to it slowly, his legs feeling like lead. The caller ID flashed. Chloe. He picked it up. Her voice came through the speaker, bright, shrill, and entirely ignorant of the world order that had just shifted. Artie, tell me the dead weight is gone. I just locked down a reservation at Le Bernardin for 8. We need to celebrate. Arthur didn't answer. He was looking down at the marble counter. Next to where the divorce papers had been, right next to the cheap blue plastic pen she had used to sign her name, was her phone. She had left her iPhone behind. The screen was lit up. It was displaying a text message she hadn't bothered to read before she walked out. Arthur reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the phone. The message was from a contact saved simply as Leo. We are outside, Principessa. Papa says the rat is dead the second you say the word. Arthur dropped the phone. It clattered against the marble, right next to his platinum wedding band. Arthur, are you there? Chloe's voice buzzed like an annoying insect in his ear. Hello? Arthur hung up. He backed away from the kitchen island, his chest heaving. Principessa, Papa. He scrambled for his laptop sitting on the dining table. He threw it open, his fingers slipping on the keys as he brought up a search engine. Lana Maria. He had never known her mother's maiden name. He had never asked. She said her family was in import-export in Chicago. He had thought that meant logistics. He had thought that meant boring. He typed wildly into the search bar. Chicago, organized crime, boss, daughters. He hit enter. Images flooded the screen. FBI surveillance photos, news clippings, headlines about racketeering, port control, and a violent changing of the guard in the Midwest underworld. At the top of the page was a black and white photograph from a federal indictment file. It was an older man with cold, dead eyes and the same heavy, unreadable brow as Lana. The caption read, Carmine, the Roman Moretti, head of the Chicago Syndicate. Arthur scrolled down, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. There was a family photo taken at a heavily guarded funeral years ago. Carmine in the center. To his left, the scarred man from the street, Dante Moretti, enforcer. To his right, another man, cold and sharp, Leo Moretti, underboss, and standing slightly behind them, dressed in a simple black coat, looking down at the ground to avoid the cameras. Quiet, unassuming. Lana Maria Moretti, the only daughter, the untouchable princess of the most violent crime family in North America. Arthur stared at the screen until his eyes burned. He hadn't divorced a librarian. He had just insulted, discarded, and humiliated the daughter of a man who bought judges and buried enemies in the foundations of skyscrapers. And she had left him her ring, her phone, and his life. For now, Arthur walked back to the window. The rain was hitting the glass harder now. He looked down at the street where the 12 cars had been. He realized, with a sudden, icy clarity, that the penthouse he loved so much was essentially a glass box in the sky. There was nowhere to run. He had wanted a woman with teeth. He just didn't realize he was already in the mouth of the wolf. The interior of the Gulfstream G650 was as silent as a tomb. Lana sat in the cream leather armchair, staring out the oval window at the heavy layer of clouds below. The rain in New York had given way to the bruised, purplish twilight of cruising altitude. She hadn't spoken since she got in the car. Dante sat across from her. He was too large for normal luxury, his broad shoulders encroaching on the aisle. He poured a measure of Amaro into a crystal glass and set it on the polished walnut table between them. He didn't push it towards her, he just left it there, an offering. "You're too thin," Dante said. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble, the sound of crushed stone. "He didn't feed you." "I ate, Dante," Lana replied softly. "I just ate small portions. You ate like a bird because he likes women who look like they blow away in the wind." Dante leaned forward, resting his heavy forearms on his knees. "I can have him dead before we touch down at O'Hare. Leo already has the layout of the building. The doorman goes off shift at 4. "No. He disrespected you. He divorced me." Lana finally looked away from the window. "There is a difference." "Not to Papa." Lana sighed, a bone-deep exhalation. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the cheap plastic hair clip that had held up her messy bun. She tossed it onto the table. Her thick, dark hair fell around her shoulders in a heavy wave. For 5 years, she had played a part. She had desperately wanted to know if there was a life outside the blood, the paranoia, the constant, suffocating weight of the Moretti name. She had found Arthur, an ambitious, emotionally stunted man who wanted a quiet, obedient shadow. She gave him exactly what he wanted. She shrunk herself. She faded into the background of his corporate ascent, hoping that by living a small, unremarkable life, she could become a small, unremarkable person. It was an exhausting experiment, and it had failed. "I don't want him touched, Dante," she said, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave, carrying the unmistakable steel of her lineage. "He isn't a rival boss. He isn't a threat. He's a civilian who made a poor domestic choice. We do not kill civilians for being stupid." Dante grunted, leaning back. "Leo disagrees. He says the disrespect bleeds onto the family. I will handle Leo. I will handle Papa." Lana picked up the Amaro and took a slow sip. The bitter, herbal liquor burned her throat, washing away the lingering taste of vanilla coffee and artificial sweetener. "Is the house ready?" It never stopped being ready, Principessa. 2 hours later, the motorcade pulled through the wrought-iron gates of the Moretti compound in Lake Forest. It was a sprawling stone fortress, disguised as a Gilded Age estate, surrounded by 20 acres of manicured lawn and high, electrified walls. Carmine Moretti was waiting on the front steps. He was 70 years old, wearing a dark cardigan over a crisp white shirt. He looked like a retired professor. He looked like a grandfather. But Lana knew that the men standing in the shadows of the portico would shoot their own mothers if he gave a subtle nod. Lana stepped out of the car. The damp Chicago wind hit her face. Carmine walked down the steps. He stopped 2 feet away from her. His dark, deep-set eyes, the exact replica of her own, scanned her face. He didn't look at the cheap clothes. He looked at the hollows of her cheeks, the faint shadows under her eyes. He raised a weathered hand and gently cupped her cheek. "My beautiful girl," Carmine murmured. "Hello, Papa." Carmine kissed her forehead. He smelled of tobacco, old leather, and a very expensive, very rare cologne. "You went looking for peace," he said quietly. "Did you find it?" "No," Lana said. "The world outside this family is a lie. Men like your husband, they believe they hold power because they have a bank account and a custom suit. They have no spine. They have no loyalty. They throw away gold because they are distracted by foil. Carmine dropped his hand. His gaze shifted past her, toward the east coast. I want his head on a spike, Lana. I want to buy his building, evict everyone in it, and burn it down with him inside. For making you leave this house. He didn't make me leave, Papa. I chose to. Lana stepped closer, forcing her father to look at her, not at his vengeance. I am home. I am staying. The experiment is over. Let Arthur Pendleton rot in his own mediocrity. He isn't worth our ammunition. Carmine studied her for a long, heavy moment. He saw the shift in her. The quiet, subdued girl who had begged to leave for Boston 5 years ago was gone. The woman standing before him had cold, dead eyes. Moretti eyes. Carmine nodded slowly. As you say, he lives. He turned and gestured toward the open doors of the mansion. Come inside. Your brother Leo is cooking. It smells like garlic and violence. Lana walked up the steps. She left the battered leather duffel bag in the trunk of the car. She wouldn't be needing it anymore. Arthur did not sleep. He spent Tuesday night pacing the length of his penthouse, jumping at every shadow, flinching every time the wind rattled the floor-to-ceiling windows. He kept the lights off. He kept a kitchen knife on the marble island, a pathetic, laughable defense against men who carried suppressed automatic weapons in their coats. By Wednesday morning, the paranoia had morphed into a desperate, frantic need for control. He showered, put on his armor, a slate-grey Tom Ford suit, and went to his office in Midtown. He needed to be on his own turf. He needed the sterile, ruthless environment of his private equity firm, Pendleton Capital. Here, he was the boss. Here, he moved the pieces. He sat behind his massive mahogany desk, staring at the dual monitors. He had spent the early hours of the morning digging into his own firm's capital structure. Pendleton Capital managed $4 billion in assets. They bought distressed companies, gutted them, and sold the scraps. But private equity required limited partners, anonymous investors who provided the raw cash. Arthur's hands shook as he traced the lineage of his 3 largest anchor investors: Aegis Holdings, Black River Logistics, Apex Marine. He had never questioned where the money came from. The checks cleared, the offshore accounts were verified, and the compliance officer had signed off. Now he ran the parent corporations of those shell companies. He ran them through obscure registry databases, tracking the managing directors to P.O. boxes in Delaware, which led to holding companies in Panama, which circled right back to a commercial real estate firm based in Chicago. Moretti Enterprises. Arthur felt all the blood drain from his face. They owned him. They had always owned him. Carmine Moretti had essentially financed Arthur's entire ego trip. Lana hadn't just been living in his apartment. Her family had bought the building, the firm, and the chair he was currently sweating in. His office door burst open. David, his CFO, walked in. David was usually a picture of unruffled wasp calm, but today his tie was loosened and he was sweating through his pale blue shirt. "Arthur, what the hell is going on?" David slapped a thick file onto the desk. "Did you piss off a senator? Did you commit securities fraud and forget to tell me?" Arthur stared at the file. "What is that?" "That is our firm collapsing," David said, his voice pitching high with panic. "I've been on the phone since 6 a.m. Aegis Holdings just triggered a liquidity clause. They're pulling their capital, all of it." Arthur's stomach bottomed out. "They can't do that. There's a lock-up period. They claim breach of fiduciary duty. They have a team of lawyers throwing injunctions at us like confetti, but that's not even the worst of it." David leaned over the desk, his eyes wide. "The Longshoremen Union in Newark just walked out on our shipping acquisition, completely paralyzed the port. Our supply chain vendors for the tech merger just invoked force majeure and terminated all contracts. In the last 4 hours, we have lost 60% of our operational value." Arthur closed his eyes. He lives, Dante had likely been told. But take everything else. They weren't going to shoot him. That was too quick. That was too merciful. They were going to strip him down to the studs. They were going to take the only thing he actually loved, his status. Arthur, you need to call the anchor investors, David pleaded. You need to fix this. Who do you know? No one, Arthur whispered. I don't know anyone. What are you talking about? Before Arthur could answer, his private line rang. It was a heavy, jarring sound in the panicked silence of the office. Arthur stared at the phone. It was an internal line, supposed to bypass the front desk. Only his most elite clients had the number. He reached out and picked up the receiver. Pendleton, Arthur. The voice was smooth, cultured. It lacked the brute force gravel of Dante or the old-world weight of Carmine. It sounded like a corporate raider. It sounded like Leo. I hear the market is volatile today. Arthur's throat seized. Leo? Mr. Moretti to you, Arthur. Only family calls me Leo. And you, very recently and very stupidly, opted out of that demographic. Listen to me, Arthur said, his voice trembling. He hated how weak he sounded, but he couldn't stop it. I didn't know. If I had known who she was... You would have kept her out of fear, Leo interrupted, the silk in his voice hardening into a blade. Yes, we know. That's why she didn't tell you. She wanted to see what kind of man you were in the dark. Turns out, you're a coward who trades his wife for a shiny hood ornament. Please, the firm is dead. We are bleeding it dry. By Friday, Pendleton Capital will be a penny stock, and you will be buried in so much litigation you won't be able to afford a hot dog from a street cart. But we aren't savages, Arthur. We believe in face-to-face negotiations. Negotiations for what? You've taken it all. For your breathing privileges, Leo said calmly. Le Bernardin. Tonight, 8 o'clock. Don't be late. I hate bad manners. The line went dead. Arthur slowly placed the receiver back on the cradle. Who was that? David asked, looking terrified. That was the Grim Reaper, Arthur said, hollowly. He looked at the framed Forbes article on his wall. Arthur Pendleton, Master of the Universe. He reached under his desk and pulled out a wastebasket. He threw up his morning coffee perfectly into the center of it. Arthur arrived at the restaurant at 7:45 p.m. Le Bernardin was normally packed on a Wednesday evening, a bustling hive of hedge fund managers, diplomats, and old money. Tonight, it was empty. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight across the windows. The front door was locked. A single man in a dark, impeccably tailored suit stood outside in the rain. He didn't ask for Arthur's name. He just opened the door and stepped aside. Arthur walked into the dining room. The silence was absolute. The waitstaff was gone. The ambient music was turned off. In the very center of the massive, opulent room, a single table was set. Leo Moretti sat on one side. He was wearing a midnight blue Brioni suit, his dark hair slicked back, a Rolex Daytona flashing on his wrist. He looked like exactly the kind of man Arthur used to pretend to be. Standing behind Leo, looming in the shadows near the wine cellar, was Dante. He wasn't wearing a suit tonight. He wore a black tactical sweater and leather gloves. He didn't look at Arthur. He looked through him. Sit, Arthur, Leo said, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. Arthur walked on legs that felt like wet sand. He pulled out the chair and sat down. His hands were shaking so badly he had to hide them under the heavy white tablecloth. You bought out the restaurant? Arthur asked. His voice cracked. We bought the building, Leo corrected smoothly. It was easier than dealing with the maitre d'. Leo steepled his fingers, leaning forward. Let us skip the pleasantries. You are currently hemorrhaging capital at a rate that will render you bankrupt by tomorrow morning. Your career is over. Your reputation is ash. You are a dead man walking. Arthur swallowed hard. I'll sign it over. The firm, the penthouse. Take it. Just let me walk away. You don't have anything to sign over, Arthur. We already own the debt on the penthouse. The firm's assets are frozen. You are offering me my own property. Leo smiled. It was a terrifying, dead smile. But I am not the one you need to negotiate with. Leo looked past Arthur toward the rear of the restaurant. Arthur heard the slow, deliberate click of heels on the hardwood floor. He didn't want to turn around. He wanted to close his eyes and wake up. But the heavy, suffocating gravity of the room forced him to turn his head. Lana was walking towards the table. Arthur's breath caught in his lungs. Gone was the oversized beige cashmere. Gone was the messy hair clip and the cheap jeans. She was wearing a sharply tailored, double-breasted black suit that fit her like armor. Her dark hair was blown out, sleek and severe, falling in a sharp line past her shoulders. Her face was perfectly contoured, striking and aristocratic. The quiet, subdued librarian was dead. She looked like a queen stepping onto a battlefield. Arthur stared at her, completely paralyzed. He had lived with this woman for 5 years. He had slept next to her. He had patronized her, ignored her, and discarded her. He had never once seen her. Lana reached the table. Leo immediately stood up, buttoning his jacket in a gesture of absolute respect. Dante stepped forward from the shadows, his posture stiffening into attention. Lana didn't sit. She stood at the head of the table, looking down at Arthur. "Lana," Arthur whispered. It sounded like a plea. "Do not use my first name, Mr. Pendleton," she said. Her voice was no longer quiet. It was clear, resonant, and freezing cold. "You lost that privilege when you slid those papers across my kitchen counter." Arthur shrank back into his chair. I made a mistake. You made a calculation," Lana corrected smoothly. "You calculated that I was weak. You calculated that I was a liability to your upward mobility. You wanted a woman who could hold a room, a woman with teeth." She tilted her head, her dark eyes pinning him to the chair. "Are you happy with the teeth you found, Arthur?" Arthur couldn't speak. His throat was entirely closed off. "I gave you 5 years of peace," Lana continued, her voice echoing slightly in the empty, cavernous restaurant. "I shielded you from a world that would have eaten you alive in 5 minutes. I played the fool so you could feel like a king, and you threw me away for a woman who complains about dinner reservations." Lana reached inside her tailored jacket. Arthur flinched violently, throwing his hands up to cover his face, expecting a gun, expecting a bullet. From the corner of his eye, Dante let out a low, mocking laugh. Lana pulled out a folded piece of thick, white legal bond paper. She tossed it onto the table in front of Arthur. Arthur lowered his hands, trembling. He looked at this paper. It was the last page of their divorce decree, the one she had signed with the cheap blue pen. "Read the signature," Lana commanded. Arthur looked down. There, in sharp, slanted cursive, she had written, "Lana Maria Moretti." "I didn't sign your name, Arthur," she said. "I signed mine. The divorce is legal. The severance is complete. You wanted a clean break. You have it." Arthur looked up, hope fluttering violently in his chest. You're letting me go?" "I am letting you live," Lana corrected. "There is a difference. Your firm is gone. Your bank accounts are frozen. The townhouse in Boston you so generously offered me has been seized by a shell corporation. You have the clothes on your back and the ego in your chest." She leaned down, placing both hands on the table, bringing her face inches from his. He could smell her perfume, vanilla and cedar. It smelled like a funeral. "You are going to walk out of this restaurant, Arthur. You're going to go back to whatever hole you can afford to rent. And for the rest of your long, miserable life, every time a black car pulls up behind you, every time a shadow moves in an alley, every time your new girlfriend looks at her phone, you will remember that you only draw breath because I allow it." Lana stood up straight. She didn't look back at him. Leo, Dante, we are finished here. She turned and walked away, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, a steady, rhythmic drumbeat of absolute ruin. Leo smiled at Arthur one last time, buttoned his suit jacket, and followed his sister. Dante lingered for a fraction of a second, staring at Arthur with empty, dead eyes, before turning to shadow them out the door. Arthur Pendleton sat completely alone in the center of the dark restaurant. He had nothing left, no firm, no penthouse, no power. He realized then that he had never built an empire. He had only ever been building his own tomb. He just didn't know the woman holding the shovel. Power in the Moretti family had never been loud. It was a foundational rule Carmine had instilled in his children from the moment they could walk. The men who shouted in this life usually ended up bleeding out on a linoleum floor. The ones who whispered dictated the terms. Lana had always been the best at whispering. It was a cold, bitter Tuesday in November, 6 months after the 12 black Rolls-Royces had parted the traffic on Fifth Avenue. The lake-effect snow was hammering against the reinforced glass windows of the Lake Forest compound. Inside, the heavy mahogany doors to Carmine's private study were shut tight. Around the massive scarred oak table sat the pillars of the Chicago Syndicate. Leo sat to Carmine's right, immaculate in a grey wool suit, reviewing a ledger. Dante stood by the fireplace, a brooding, silent mountain of muscle. 4 capos, older, harder men with faces like beaten copper, occupied the remaining chairs. Lana sat at the far end of the table. She wore a simple black turtleneck and dark slacks. She had a pen in her hand, not a cheap plastic one, but a heavy, matte black fountain pen. She was taking notes. She hadn't spoken in 45 minutes. Victor, a capo who ran the South Side distribution lines, was sweating. He was a thick-necked man who still believed business was settled with tire irons and shallow graves. "The Russian pricks are leaning on the transit union," Victor barked, slamming a meaty hand onto the table. The coffee cups rattled. "They're holding up 4 shipments of electronics at the rail yards. They want 20% of the gross to let the trains move. I say we send a crew tonight, break a few knees at the dispatch center, send a message." Leo looked up from his ledger. "You break knees, the feds swarm the yard by morning. We lose the shipments entirely to evidence lockers. So we just pay them." Victor sneered. "We roll over." Carmine remained silent, his eyes half closed, watching his men argue. It was a test. He rarely intervened until the solution presented itself. Lana stopped writing. She set the pen down. The click of the metal against the wood was soft, but in a room trained to listen for the shifting of gears, it was deafening. Victor stopped talking. He looked at Lana. The capos still struggled with her presence. For 30 years, she had been the untouchable princess, the civilian kept far away from the blood. Now she was sitting at the table where the blood was measured and sold. "Victor," Lana said. Her voice was quiet, level. "Who owns the land the rail yard is built on?" Victor frowned, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "The city. It's public zoning." "Incorrect," Lana replied, pulling a manila folder from the stack in front of her. She didn't look at Victor. She looked at the paperwork. "The city leases the operational rights to a private holding company called Great Lakes Transit. Great Lakes Transit is a subsidiary of a real estate trust based in Delaware." She slid the folder down the long table. It stopped squarely in front of Victor. "I spent 5 years sitting in a multi-million-dollar penthouse, listening to a private equity firm gut American infrastructure," Lana said, her eyes finally lifting to meet Victor's. The sheer freezing weight in her gaze made the older man shift uncomfortably in his chair. "I learned a great deal about how the legal world steals money. It is far more efficient than extortion." Leo smiled, a thin, razor-sharp smile. "Go on, Lana. We don't send a crew to break knees," she continued smoothly. We acquire the debt of the holding company. They are heavily leveraged. I've already drafted the buyout protocol through our front companies. By Friday, we will legally own the operational rights to the yard. When the Russians show up to extort the Union, they won't be trespassing on city property. They will be trespassing on private land. Dante grunted from the fireplace. Our land. Exactly, Lana said. And when armed men trespass on private, federally subsidized logistics land, we don't need to shoot them. We call private security. We press federal racketeering charges, and we let the FBI do our heavy lifting. The Russians lose their leverage, their men go to federal prison, and we maintain complete anonymity. The shipments move. The room was dead silent. The only sound was the crackle of the birch logs burning in the hearth. Victor stared at the documents in the folder. He couldn't read half the financial jargon, but he understood the checkmate. He looked up at Lana, the sneer entirely gone from his face, replaced by a cautious, fearful respect. That's corporate, Victor muttered. It is evolution, Victor, Carmine finally spoke. His voice was a low rasp that commanded absolute obedience. He looked at his daughter, his chest swelling with a terrifying pride. The days of Tommy guns and corner shootouts are over. The real blood is spilled on paper now. My daughter understands the new weapons. Carmine leaned forward, placing his weathered hands flat on the table. From today forward, Lana is no longer observing, Carmine announced. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. She is the architect of our legitimate acquisitions. Every holding company, every front, every financial transaction goes through her desk. She has my proxy. Leo nodded in agreement. He didn't resent her rise. He welcomed it. He was the sword, but Lana was the shield. The capos exchanged quick, solemn glances. Then, one by one, they nodded. Victor closed the folder and pushed it back toward the center of the table. Understood, boss, Victor said. He looked at Lana and gave a slow, deliberate nod of his head. Understood, Ms. Moretti. Lana picked up her pen. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply opened a new page in her notebook. Now, Lana said quietly, let us discuss the municipal judges up for re-election. She had spent half a decade shrinking herself to fit into a man's shadow. She was done shrinking. She was building an empire in the light. Arthur Pendleton was riding the subway. It was the N train, rattling its way deep into Queens, smelling of stale urine and damp wool. Arthur sat staring at the scarred plastic floor between his feet. He was wearing a suit, but it wasn't Tom Ford. It was a polyester blend from a discount rack, the collar already beginning to fray. His reflection in the grimy subway window looked like a stranger. The sharp, confident jawline was gone. Buried under a layer of stress-induced bloat and a patchy greying beard he didn't care enough to shave. The cold, assessing eyes of the CEO were bloodshot and exhausted. It had been 8 months since the dinner at Le Bernardin. 8 months since he was erased from the world. The Moretti family hadn't killed him. Death would have been an act of mercy. Instead, they had subjected him to a systematic, microscopic dismantling of his entire existence. Pendleton Capital had been dissolved in a flurry of aggressive litigation and SEC audits. The shell companies that had pulled their capital didn't just leave, they sued him for mismanagement. The legal fees had drained his personal accounts within weeks. The bank foreclosed on the penthouse. The luxury cars were repossessed. Even his personal network had evaporated overnight. When you are toxic to billions of dollars in organized capital, word travels fast in the financial sector. No firm would touch him, not even the bottom-feeder brokerage houses. His name was a plague. Chloe had left him exactly 6 days after the accounts were frozen. She didn't leave a note. She just packed her designer bags and ordered an Uber to the Hamptons to stay with a hedge fund manager who still had a platinum card. Arthur hadn't even tried to call her. He knew exactly what he had bought, and he knew why she was returning it. The train screeched to a halt at Astoria Boulevard. Arthur pulled his coat tight against the chill and stepped out onto the elevated platform. He walked 4 blocks in the freezing rain to a cheap diner tucked between a laundromat and a defunct hardware store. The bell above the door chimed a pathetic, off-key note as he entered. The air inside was thick with grease and old coffee. He slid into a torn vinyl booth in the back. Across from him sat Greg, a former junior partner at Pendleton Capital. Greg was looking around nervously, pulling the collar of his expensive overcoat up around his neck. "You're 10 minutes late," Greg muttered, refusing to meet Arthur's eye. "The train was delayed," Arthur said, his voice flat. He didn't bother offering an apology. "Did you bring it?" Greg reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He slid it across the sticky Formica table. "There's 10,000 in there," Greg said quickly. "Cash, unmarked, like you asked. But this is the last time, Arthur. I mean it. I can't be seen with you. My new firm just landed a contract with Aegis Holdings. If they find out I'm fronting you money, I'm dead in the water." Arthur put his hand on the envelope. It felt incredibly light. He used to spend $10,000 on a weekend trip to Aspen without checking his balance. Now it was his lifeline. It was 3 months of rent for his miserable, roach-infested studio apartment. "Aegis Holdings," Arthur repeated softly. A bitter, hollow laugh scraped the back of his throat. "They own your new firm too." "What?" Greg frowned. "Nothing." "Thank you, Greg." Arthur slid the envelope into his coat pocket. Greg stood up immediately. He didn't say goodbye. He just turned and practically bolted for the door, eager to wash the stench of failure off him. Arthur sat alone in the booth. A waitress with a tired face approached and dropped a laminated menu on the table. "Coffee?" she asked. "Just water," Arthur said. He couldn't afford the luxury of diner coffee. He looked up at the small television bolted to the corner of the ceiling. It was tuned to a local business news channel. The anchor was discussing a massive real estate acquisition downtown. In a stunning move today, the newly formed Moretti Vanguard Trust has acquired the historic Chrysler Building in a multi-billion-dollar private transaction. Arthur's breath stopped. He stared at the screen. The news feed cut to a press conference held earlier that afternoon. A bank of microphones was set up in front of the iconic Art Deco building. Stepping up to the podium was Lana. She wore a stark white trench coat over a dark suit, looking like a blade of pure, uncut diamond. Her hair was pulled back tight, her face a mask of elegant, untouchable authority. Flanking her, just out of focus, were the massive, broad-shouldered shapes of her brothers. Arthur felt a physical pain in his chest. A tight, crushing pressure. "This acquisition represents our commitment to the architectural heritage of New York." Lana's voice drifted through the static of the diner television. It was calm, cultured, perfectly modulated. The voice of a predator who had already eaten and was merely rearranging the bones. Arthur remembered standing in his kitchen, offering her a $2 million trust and a townhouse, expecting her to weep with gratitude. He remembered telling her he needed someone who could hold a room. He watched her hold the entire city of New York in the palm of her hand. He reached into his pocket and closed his hand around the cheap plastic pen he had kept. The one she had used to sign the papers. He carried it everywhere, not out of love, out of penance. It was the only artifact he had left of the moment he voluntarily stepped off the edge of the world. He sat in the greasy booth, shivering in his damp polyester suit, and watched his quiet wife rule the empire he had always pretended to own. The air in the private dining room of the Chicago club smelled of old wealth, aged scotch, imported leather, and the faint metallic tang of ozone before a storm. It was the gathering of the commission. Once every 5 years, the heads of the remaining 5 syndicates across the Midwest and the Eastern Seaboard met to redefine territories, settle blood feuds, and adjust to the shifting tides of federal law enforcement. The men in the room were relics, heavy with decades of violence. They sat around the circular mahogany table, their bodyguards positioned by the oak-panelled doors. Carmine Moretti sat at the designated head of the table. He looked older today. His shoulders stooped slightly under the weight of his dark suit. He had spent 40 years holding back the wolves, and his bones were tired. Leo stood to his right. Dante stood by the window, watching the street below. Lana sat to Carmine's left. The other bosses, Marcello from Detroit, Russo from Cleveland, and two heavy hitters from Philadelphia and Boston, eyed her with a mixture of suspicion and deep-seated chauvinism. Women did not sit at this table. Women attended the funerals and cooked the Sunday dinners. They did not review the ledgers. Carmine, Marcello said, lighting a thick cigar. We respect your family, we respect your blood, but we are discussing the interstate trucking routes. We are discussing the movement of product. This is not a conversation for civilians. He gestured lazily toward Lana with the glowing end of his cigar. Carmine didn't say a word. He just leaned back in his chair and folded his hands over his stomach. Lana looked at Marcello. She didn't bristle at the insult. She didn't let anger flush her cheeks. Anger was a leak in the boat. It let the water in. She opened the leather folio resting in front of her. Mr. Marcello, Lana said. Her voice was barely a whisper, yet it cut through the heavy air of the room like a scalpel. The interstate trucking routes you are referring to rely on the I-90 corridor through Indiana and Ohio, specifically the way stations. Marcello frowned, lowering his cigar. Yeah, so, Lana continued, pulling a crisp sheet of paper from the folio. 6 months ago, the Department of Transportation initiated a private-public partnership to overhaul the digital logging systems at those specific way stations. They outsourced the software management to a tech firm in Silicon Valley. The room grew very still. That tech firm, Lana said, her dark eyes locking onto Marcello's, was quietly acquired by Vanguard Logistics, a holding company I personally structured. Which means, gentlemen, that every truck moving through your sacred I-90 corridor is currently being logged, weighed, and tracked by my servers. She slid the paper across the table. It was a printout of the software architecture, stamped with the Vanguard logo. I know exactly how much product you are moving, Mr. Marcello, Lana said softly. I know that Russo's trucks are running 30% lighter than his manifests claim, which means he's skimming from the joint pool. And I know that the feds are currently running a shadow audit on the Philadelphia operation, which means if you use those routes next month, you will all be indicted under RICO. Russo paled, choking on his own breath. Marcello stared at the paper, the cigar turning to ash in his hand. You brought us here to discuss routes, Lana said, closing the folio with a soft, final snap. I am telling you that you no longer own the routes. You rent them from me, and the rent just went up. Absolute silence descended on the Chicago club. The old men looked at the young woman in the dark suit. They looked for the bluff. They looked for the hesitation. They found nothing but a vast, freezing void. They found Carmine Moretti's eyes, staring back at them from his daughter's face. Carmine reached out and placed a hand on Lana's shoulder. It was a gesture of immense, tectonic significance. He was officially passing the crown. Leo smiled proudly. Dante finally looked away from the window, his chest swelling. Are there any further questions about my daughter's presence at this table? Carmine asked. His voice was a rasping, quiet threat. Marcello slowly picked up the paper. He looked at Russo, who gave a defeated, terrified shake of his head. No, Carmine, Marcello muttered, putting his cigar down in the ashtray. No questions. The meeting concluded an hour later. The terms were dictated entirely by Lana. Bloodshed was avoided. Billions of dollars shifted hands on ledgers hidden behind firewalls and proxy servers. The violence of the old world had been neatly, efficiently replaced by the ruthless mechanics of the new. When the other bosses left, looking significantly older and more tired than when they arrived. Lana remained at the table. She walked over to the large bay windows overlooking Michigan Avenue. The city lights were beginning to flicker on in the gathering dusk, a sea of diamonds scattered across the grid. She thought of Arthur briefly, a fleeting, insignificant memory, like a dull ache in a bone that had healed years ago. He had wanted a wife who fit into a box. He had wanted a woman who could decorate his life. She looked down at her hands. They weren't decorated with platinum bands or expensive, fragile stones. They were bare, unburdened. Leo stepped up beside her, holding out 2 crystal glasses of aged bourbon. He handed one to her. "You gutted them," Leo said, admiration ringing clear in his tone. "Papa is right. You are more dangerous than Dante with a rifle." "Dante aims at the heart," Lana said, taking a slow sip of the burning liquid. "I aim at the wallet. The wallet takes longer to heal." Down on the street below, a procession of heavy black vehicles began to pull up to the curb. Not 12 this time, just 4. Enough to secure the perimeter, enough to announce the presence of royalty. Dante opened the heavy oak doors of the dining room. "Cars are ready, boss," he said, looking past his father, looking directly at his sister. Lana set her glass down on the window sill. She adjusted the lapels of her suit jacket. The quiet wife was dead and buried. The matriarch of the syndicate had finally come home. "Let's go," Lana said. She walked out of the room, her footsteps steady and absolute, leaving the ghosts of the past entirely behind her. Some men build cages and call them castles, never realizing the quiet bird inside isn't trapped. She's just resting before she takes the whole sky. Lana's evolution from discarded wife to untouchable mob queen proves that silence isn't a weakness, it's a loaded weapon. Arthur wanted a woman who could hold a room, but he ended up paying the price for a woman who could buy the whole city.